whether this person qualifies for having clinical depression or whether they're just, having a bad time, and this person takes an antidepressant that lifts their mood. Is that treatment or an enhancement? Maybe we are not sure. It's in the gray area. But the point I'm making here is different. The point of therapeutic enhancements is to say there are interventions that are very clearly treatments and very clearly enhancements at the same time. Yes, there are certainly such things as pure treatments and pure enhancements that don't have therapeutic benefits, but there is also a third category, which is a hybrid category of interventions that have effects of both types. And then we can distinguish what I would call a broad sense of therapeutic enhancement. So in this sense, a therapeutic enhancement is any intervention that has both therapeutic and enhancement effects. And a narrow sense to be distinguished. So a therapeutic enhancement in the narrow sense is an intervention that has enhancement effects, and these enhancement effects are necessary for its therapeutic benefits. They're a condition of the therapeutic benefits. Now, so what interventions am I talking about? So an example that has often been given in the literature is vaccinations. Vaccinations enhance the immune system to prevent the future onset of disease, and it's traditional to distinguish among therapeutic interventions between those that restore health, so sort of pure treatments, and those that maintain health, anti-interventions. So vaccinations are an example of a preventive intervention. Now, I guess one could have some debate about whether vaccinations are really enhancements. It depends exactly on how we define the term. What should we say in a situation where everybody gets vaccinated? Well, one might wonder, have we redefined the threshold of health so that health includes being vaccinated? The person who's not vaccinated is somehow some pathological state. But I think that there are other examples of therapeutic enhancements that avoid these possible controversies. If we look at sort of more futuristic interventions that some researchers are trying to develop, so one that I cite in the paper is anti-aging interventions, more specifically rejuvenation technology, interventions that would sort of turn back the biological clock, reverse the aging process. There are some ambitious researchers who are trying to develop this type of interventions. And one motive for trying to do that is to stave off the onset of aging-associated diseases like dementia. So that this type of intervention, if it succeeded, it would enhance some health traits, such as the fitness of perhaps like a 60-year-old. You could have a healthy 60-year-old or a healthy 70-year-old who would have the level of functioning of a young person. So, and I've also mentioned 3D bioprinting. So this is also a technology that includes sort of the futuristic applications that provide examples of therapeutic enhancement. So if you think of an artificial heart that was less susceptible to cardiovascular disease than a normal human heart, if we implanted this in someone who had a disease that could not be cured without a transplant, that might count as a therapeutic enhancement as well. Now, to have a philosophical part, coming to, I guess, the most philosophical part of my talk, but as I will mention, I think it has important practical implications. We have to be clear on how we define treatments and enhancements. And in fact, whether or not we want to say that these therapeutic enhancements exist, whether or not we should acknowledge this separate category, depends on how we define and how we formulate treatment enhancement distinction. So my favorite formulation says that treatments are biomedical interventions that improve human appearance, functioning, or performance in a way that achieves, restores, or maintains health. Right. So here we get the distinction between pure treatments and preventive interventions. By contrast, I define enhancements as again biomedical interventions that improve human appearance, functioning, or performance, but in a way that goes beyond the pure achievement, restoration, or maintenance of health. What exactly does that mean to go beyond this threshold? Well, there are at least two ways an intervention could be said to do that. One is if the intervention improves a healthy trait, then it's an enhancement. Another way is if the intervention improves someone functioning and starts from a pathological state, but improves the person's functioning to such a degree that it ends up being above the level that the person would otherwise have enjoyed if she had not suffered the relevant pathology. Then again, even though in that case a healthy trait is not improved upon, but I still think we can say intuitively it seems we're dealing with a case of enhancement. So on this definition, these sort of cases that I've mentioned, anti-aging interventions, super organs, they count as therapeutic enhancements. And some of them are therapeutic enhancements in the narrow sense. However, there is a way to avoid acknowledging this category of therapeutic enhancements by adopting a different formulation of the treatment enhancement distinction. One example would be the approach, which is mentioned in the US report on human genome. So Jung defines enhancements as interventions that improve human functioning beyond what is necessary to restore or preserve human health. So if we assume, say, that the only way to stave off aging-associated diseases is to develop an intervention like some form of rejuvenation technology, then it seems that this intervention will not count as an enhancement according to Jung's definition. It would just be a treatment, a preventive, purely preventive intervention. So that's one move that one could make. As I explained in the paper, I think that is not a desirable position to take because I think it has very counterintuitive implications. For instance, it means that no matter how radically transformative the effects of some intervention could be, say, rejuvenation technology, who knows how transformative this could be. You could have an intervention that could perhaps increase the human lifespan, that could turn 70-year-olds into 50-year-olds or even younger, who knows. And that still won't count as an enhancement on this definition because of this clause about being necessary to preserve good health. And I think it just seems arbitrary to sort of rule out, to ignore the transformative effects of an intervention just because of its preventive effects, right? And then if we think that the treatment enhancement distinction has this strong normative force, we end up, on this view, we end up saying, well, you could have something that would satisfy transhumanist dreams, but that's still a treatment, so that's fine, right? It's not effective because it is preventive in nature. However, you have something that is a pure enhancement that had a very mild, much less transformative effect, and you would say, well, that's problematic because that's an enhancement. I think that's very counterintuitive. Another counterintuitive implication of Jung's approach, I think, is that there is some ambiguity to this idea of what is necessary to preserve or maintain or restore health. So, for instance, on one interpretation of this condition, you would have to conclude that suppose optimistically that by 2040 we have an effective form of rejuvenation technology that staves off dementia indefinitely. And that's the only way we can do that. This state of affairs, that's a treatment according to Jung's definition. However, then suppose that someone, a researcher, comes up with another kind of intervention that has the same therapeutic benefit, but maybe does not have the similar enhancement effects. So maybe it does not improve the fitness of the people who benefit from the intervention. It does not turn back the biological clock. It does in another way. But now maybe the initial intervention does come, even though it's exactly the same intervention, but now we have a different intervention, which means it is no longer necessary to achieve desired therapeutic benefit. So now it's an enhancement. Again, that strikes me as very counterintuitive. So on those grounds, I think that my approach is preferable. My approach does not have those counterintuitive implications. Now, what follows at the practical regulation level? So, what I want to say is one thing I want to say, pretty simple, is that we need to take more into account the existence of this category of interventions when we think about how we want to regulate biomedical enhancements. As I've mentioned, this is something that has been identified for about 20 years or more. And in fact, even the US report on human genome editing does allude to this and mentions Leroy Walters and their work on this. But then when it comes to actually making a regulatory proposal, they seem to throw this completely out of the window. I don't think that they really incorporate it into their analysis, and I don't think many people have done so. So I think that is something that we need to take more into account, to have a more accurate analysis and also more accurate policies that we can propose for regulation. Therapeutic enhancements do challenge some of the assumptions that are typically made about biomedical enhancements. For instance, in terms of, well, their social benefits, they have therapeutic benefits, so these are pretty uncontroversial. Their risk-benefit ratio doesn't have to be worse than therapeutic interventions, since there are biomedical interventions that are preventive in nature. Therapeutic enhancements could have a very similar risk-benefit ratio. It is possible that pure treatments might tend to have a more favorable risk-benefit ratio than preventive interventions in general, but even that's not fully clear, and I think the main point is that the risk-benefit ratio of preventive interventions can be acceptable. So that means we can't just infer that something is an enhancement, that it is to do clinical trials. Now, as I mentioned in the paper, I don't want to conclude from this that treatment enhancement distinction has no normative force, so that it should be rejected. I do believe that it's conceptually useful. It tells us something about the nature of the interventions in question. Also, I do think that it can be relevant to the regulation of technologies in sort of narrow, specific contexts. Take cosmetic surgery, for instance. I know that in the United Kingdom, cosmetic interventions would be funded by the NHS if you can demonstrate a therapeutic purpose, reconstructive surgery, for instance, but typically not if they are purely cosmetic in nature. That sounds like a pretty reasonable policy, but I don't think that the justification behind it is simply that an enhancement has this kind of normative force that's associated with it. I think it depends on various factors, just the fact that it's difficult to measure the sort of impact on well-being that cosmetic surgery might have. Also, there's a problem of what Norman Daniels has called moral hazard. right? If you try to identify how much suffering can cosmetic surgery relieve, how much psychological suffering can it relieve, then you'd have to ask people how satisfied they are with their lives, and they could manipulate the polls to make sure that they come up as very dissatisfied so that they would qualify as eligible for publicly funded cosmetic surgery. So you get into these kind of problems with interventions like that. So I don't think you can just have appeal straightforwardly to the treatment enhancement distinction to justify this kind of policy, but I agree that it can be a sensible certain specific contexts. Nonetheless, I would say that we can just use it as a sort of broad criterion for deciding whether we should permit some research to proceed or not, or whether it should be funded by collective resources or not. I think we have more adequate criteria to rely on for those purposes. For instance, we can do a risk-benefit analysis of any particular intervention. We can do a cost-effectiveness analysis and use these in our decision-making. Also, if we think that there are other relevant principles for a fair allocation of healthcare resources, we can also appeal to them. Prioritarianism is an example, the idea that we should prioritize people who have lower levels of well-being. There's various ways in which this can be done, but this is another plausible appeal. And may well be, once we've used those various criteria, that most of the interventions that will allow to proceed and most interventions that will be publicly funded will be treatments and not enhancements. But what the important thing is, even then, this would be the result of the allocation process. There's a difference between a result favoring treatments over enhancements and having our very decision-making process biased from the very beginning in favor of treatments. I think that's a mistake. I think that if we start privileging treatments, qua treatments, as distinct from who they benefit, how cost-effective they are, how safe they are, then we are in the grip of a bias which I've called treatment fetishism. And that's something we should avoid. We should be sufficiently attuned to the various risks and benefits involved in all these interventions and be aware of also the therapeutic potential that even interventions that qualify as enhancements can have. Now, to conclude, I want to say a word about the idea of purpose, which is present in some of the discussions, including in this recommendation that I've mentioned by US academies on human genome editing. So they say we should only allow clinical trials of human genome editing to proceed if they have a therapeutic purpose, not if they have a different purpose. I guess one could use this to try and alleviate the sort of concerns that I've raised about treatment fetishism. So someone might say, look, I agree that there are these therapeutic enhancements that you've described. They are possible, maybe they are desirable, but the recommendations of this report do not rule them out, because if someone wants to develop an intervention like that, they can just claim their purpose is therapeutic, right? So George Church, who's a Harvard geneticist who is interested in using human genome editing to reverse human aging, ambitious projects, presumably he would state that his goal is protecting people from dementia, from the diseases of old age. In which case you might say, well, he passes the tests. His research is fine by the recommendations of that report. Now, that's all well and good. However, even though I'm someone who tends to fall more on the pro-enhancement side of the debate, I'm not satisfied with this type of approach. I think it is not sort of fine-grained enough. fact, I think it creates a loophole, which is undesirable. Maybe it would allow researchers to use what I call therapeutic methods. So just basically being able to show that an intervention that they are trying to develop has some therapeutic benefits, that would basically give them a free pass. Once they've shown that, any other aspects of the intervention might get set aside. And that just seems inappropriate, right? At least, especially for people who are worried about enhancement and think that there is something potentially ethically problematic about those interventions, these people should not accept the therapeutic defense, because otherwise researchers will people who want to develop enhancements just need to conduct clinical trials using people with some form of pathology and be able to show that their intervention will have benefits for these people, no matter how significant their enhancement effects might be. So if you want to use sort of fictional case, imagine some cognitive enhancer, which massively improve someone's cognitive ability, turn someone into a genius, as long as you could use it with someone with cognitive disability. If you consider this therapeutic, then there you go, you've passed the test, and the debate is closed. And that just sounds simple. So yes, I think the focus on purpose is not satisfactory. I think purpose, the proper place of purpose, is insofar as it gives us indications about the likely effects of an intervention that we do not yet have. That's what purpose is relevant to. But caring about purpose for its own sake and sort of making ethical decisions based on that, that just seems to me to be focusing on the wrong consideration. So I guess I'll stop here. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you for the presentation. I think I should open the floor for discussion. So first of all, I would ask you to ask questions concerning their presentation, not sharing your opinion, because there would be time after that when you would be able to discuss in a form of panel discussion. So you're welcome. Your questions?
So thanks for your presentation. To sum up, can you state what are the benefits of this therapeutic enhancement term? So can you just say shortly, why do you think it's useful for us to take on this term and use it in our analysis? So I feel like you're trying not to reject the previous dichotomy of therapy and enhancement. You're trying to save it for some other purpose, and so what's the use of your new concept? Can you just say shortly, please?
Right. So I'm not accepting the dichotomy between treatments and enhancements, but I do want to accept the categories themselves. I think the categories of therapy and enhancement are conceptually useful, so I don't want to reject them and say that that we need to speak in some different way and abandon these categories. But I do want to challenge the idea of a dichotomy. So I think it's too simple to just say we have two categories that are mutually exclusive with a gray area maybe between the two, so the border between them would be unclear, vague. I want to say these are two categories of interventions that overlap. So some interventions fall into both categories. And that seems to me the best way to describe certain interventions. And I think it's useful for purposes of conceptual clarity and also for crafting public policy in the most rational way we can. That is I think the goal we ought to be pursuing.
Basically, the pragmatic use for like management of public health, right? So you say.
Well, first it's sort of philosophical interest, I guess, because it's it's a conceptual discussion. But I think it's relevant to policy making because some policies seem to rest on an assumption of a dichotomy. I think that's, as mentioned, as I argue in the paper, I think that's defensible. And also it can mislead us, it can lead us to just fail to properly analyze, fail to potentially miss either the benefits or perhaps sometimes the risks of some interventions. I think it has a tendency to take us away from the details of each intervention and sort of put them into boxes, and then the label that we put on them is supposed to do the ethical work. And I think that's not helpful. I think that's wrong-headed.
Any other questions?
Hello, my name is Pavel, P-A-V-E-L, and the previous speaker, her name is Alexandra, by the way. Okay, sorry. I think that there is one very, I should say, very sensitive point, because you are speaking on behalf of human individuals and human as a species, but as a matter of fact, we are living in a more complex environment, and microbiota, for example, for me, is something that should be taken into acknowledge. We couldn't speak about enhancement of human beings without enhancement of microbiota, with enhancement of microbes. And to some extent, there is no, I should say, mutual agreement, because microbes live on human beings, and human beings wouldn't like to be a meal for microbes. And my point is that if human beings are prudent enough, they should think about survival and prosperity of microbiota. That means that we should accept diseases as soon as it's normal, as a matter of fact, from biological point of view, interactions between human organisms and microbes. Absolutely normal. And the dying of human beings is individuals is absolutely normal. As soon as the extinction of a biological species are also normal. That means, of course, we could selfishly fight with microbes. We could selfishly immunize ourselves with vaccination and etc., etc. But I think that if we are prudent enough, we should think about the more general context. We should enhance our microbes. We should take care of microbes. We should let them to survive, and to be prosperity of microbes is our basic interest, as a matter of fact. And as a matter of fact, what we know, what the new knowledge that is streaming as a flood from a lot of projects on microbiota is very interesting, and just ruins our standard understanding of human beings as individuals placed in a world somewhere. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's an interesting perspective that I haven't heard before. I should mention I'm no expert. I'm a philosopher by training, so I'm no expert on microbiota. But I would, what I would want to ask you in response would be, I'm not sure to what extent you're making an argument about safety and ensuring the safety of new biomedical interventions. This is what you're worried about, or to what extent you're making a normative argument about what the right lifespan for human beings is, or what sort of conditions are part of nature and we should not tinker with nature, because these are different arguments, right? I mean, in one case you're worried about the risk involved with certain interventions. In another case, you're going beyond risk. You're saying there is an order that needs to be maintained regardless of whether or not we have safe interventions. So, for instance, do you think that there are already interventions like vaccines that are violating your concerns about, you were saying that things are natural, like there are many diseases are natural and we have developed interventions against them? Where is what you?
Thank you. My point is that we should look for such arrangements in our doing, pursuing our pretty selfish interests in prolonging our life and not thinking about good death, for example. My point is very simple, that any other our intervention should consider as a good result a kind of a balance of interests of human beings and microbiota.
So I guess I'd like
even
to
vaccination, just let microbes to develop themselves. And you see, I have in mind a kind of domestication of microbes, not extermination, because it's meaningless that the basic idea of previous model of medicine was just let's exterminate microbes and we'll be healthy. Even now we could see commercials, oh, it's a nice soap, it kills all microbes. I think it's absolutely a dangerous idea. To kill all microbes means to kill human beings. We should think about the balance of interests of microbes and humans.
Okay. Well, I can assure you that I am not supportive of a project that wants to eradicate all microbes. I was focusing on specific interventions, including some interventions that could increase the healthy human lifespan. I think these are interesting and I would argue desirable, but I certainly would not say that we have to eradicate microbes and that we must not take into account the effects that interventions that would reduce the number of microbes in the world could have on human health, of course.
My point is healthy human beings means healthy microbiota also. We should think about balance, not about selfish human individuals. And human health is dependent very strongly on the health of microbiota. And even the mentality of humans. No, it's another question.
I'm not sure there's a disagreement between us. I'm not sure that this is incompatible with my view, but okay. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Maybe some other questions? Sophie, do we have questions on the comments in YouTube? Yeah? No. So I have a couple of questions. You have spoken about funding of plastic surgery in Great Britain, that National Institute of Health can fund or not fund the significant intervention due to treatment enhancement distinction. But I have a question. Is this problem, the distinction of treatment and enhancement, only the problem of funding, or there are some other more deep problems that we need to speak about, speaking about practical field of our work, speaking about some normative borders between treatment and enhancement? Or if we had enough money, okay, there would not be a problem of treatment and enhancement. We can fund all interventions, and we can fund all investigations as in treatment, as in enhancement, without any differences.
Right, thanks. So yes, I think, so as I mentioned at the beginning, there are sort of more extreme positions that rely on the treatment enhancement distinction and more moderate ones. And I think the more extreme positions tend to be associated with sort of more substantive normative claims about the allegedly bad effects or maybe the bad nature of enhancements. If you think of someone like Michael Sandel, for instance, who booked the case against perfection, he thinks enhancements will corrupt human character and corrupt our relationship with our children, for instance. And so that's distinct from the sort of concerns that someone like Norman Daniels might have, for instance. Norman Daniels would be more in the sort of what I've described as a moderate camp, and he's more focused on questions of allocation of resources and the fact that we have scarce resources. We cannot fund everything, so we have to set priorities. So that is why he brings in the treatment enhancement thing, because he thinks that we should distribute the opportunity so that we can promote by using these resources fairly, and there is a certain threshold which he thinks is sort of a kind of a sufficiency threshold that owe to people, but we don't owe them more than that. So that's how he appeals to the treatment enhancement distinction. But there is still a difference between these two approaches. I think that the arguments from the moderates are stronger than the others. I'm not saying we can have an interesting discussion about, Michael Sandel and the bioconservative objections to enhancement. I'm on the other camp for full disclosure. I'm usually not persuaded by their arguments, but I think it's an interesting debate to have.
Okay, thank you. And I have one more question about genome editing, as you mentioned. You have spoken that it is, and it is really very significant topic of contemporary bioethical debates. But I consider that this technology, biotechnology, goes beyond treatment enhancement distinction, because when it would be elaborated technology, even for treatment, we can easily apply it for enhancement, because for this technology there is no difference what to edit, what gene would be edited. Is it something like a pathological gene of maybe cystic fibrosis gene, or maybe the gene that leads to maybe the eye color, or maybe some other physical, lead to some other physical consequences or physiological consequences. So does some distinctions work in the case of genome editing if we imagine that this technology is already elaborated?
So in that case, yes, there would be the distinction would still apply in terms of type of use. What you said suggests that it might be difficult to prevent at least some enhancement applications of the technology, even if we manage to confine the research for purely therapeutic purposes, that there could be these sort of off-label uses, as we've seen with other psychoactive drugs, for instance. So yes, you could have a policy that said, oh, this is approved for this type of use, not for this other type of use. How easy would it be for private individuals to engage in off-label use in the enhancement of something that was initially therapeutic? I'm not sure about that. Like the authors of the US report seem rather skeptical that this could be of a great magnitude. So they say that, I think because of the specificity of the genes that are targeted, that it would be difficult to have a lot of off-label use. They say maybe something for muscular dystrophy, you could use it to perhaps gain muscle mass even if you did not have the disease. So I'm not sure what the potential is, but we can imagine that it could happen, and that would mirror the sort of case we have right now, say with psychostimulants, which are quite widely used off-label, say on various university campuses. Students use them to study throughout the night, and many other people use them as well. So yeah.
Yeah, but one point, I think that there is a difference between universalization, for example, of psychostimulants and off-label use of genome editing, because genome editing as technology of editing of any part of genome is ready. When it would be ready for treatment use, it would be ready for some other use in human germline cells or any other cells as we want to edit. Okay, and we have one more question in our YouTube stream. Ellen Sokolova, also medical anthropologist, she asks, I will read her comment, and some people think of aging as a kind of disease. Yes, we have some transhumanists in Russia. So they might find anti-aging CRISPR genome editing intervention useful. Many others could say that it is a natural enhancement associated with high risks. Thus, it is unclear if it is enhancement or treatment, or which point of view to take. What do you think of this case?
So I agree that it really depends on the details of the intervention and what exactly it does. So whether or not aging itself is a disease, I'm not sure it is a disease myself, but I don't think it's to deciding whether or not it's a desirable process. that affects human life. But even if it isn't a disease, it's associated, it's a very, very big risk factor for a series of diseases. And that's where the interest is in trying to reverse the process. Now, my assumption was that interventions that would work, that would accomplish this goal, would probably improve certain aspects of the person's functioning. It was administered, especially preventively, and improve some health aspects of a person's functioning. So my view is that it is an enhancement and at the same time a preventive intervention. But this would this assumes that there is this improvement in a person's healthy functioning. If all we did was eliminate an aging-associated disease and we brought the person back to health, that would just be a treatment. So it really depends on the specific nature of the intervention.
Okay, from the face of Elaine, I can say thank you for your response. So if there are no more questions, maybe there is a time for panel discussion. Any of you have around 5 minutes to share your ideas, your opinions, your comments for today's topic. So you're welcome.
So yeah, my interest in this conceptual issue of whether therapy enhancement distinction is valid or not is actually related to my own research. So I'm working with blind people and I'm trying to understand whether this helps me at all, like this distinction. And so one of the thoughts that I have is that basically this distinction is based on a highly medicalized jargon. So it's rooted in biomedicine and it kind of keeps on this tradition, right? So we just take what was born in biomedicine, and then as a social scientist go with it, right? So we keep this distinction pretty much not reflexively, I feel. Yeah, if you think of like blind people, we understand that what is understood as one biomedical norm actually can be very diverse. So we all have different bodies, different like sensual perception, and so for me, this distinction doesn't work when I talk to like blind people at all. Yeah, and another thing is that an interesting thing that I heard in your presentation is that when you gave a definition to treatment and enhancement, it was like treatment is always something more solid, right? It's always something more pure, like something necessary. That's again from the definition. And enhancement is something frivolous, something not really necessary. So yeah, if we again, as Sergey said, if we have all the money of the world and we don't need to think about like funding research and funding treatment, will we keep this distinction at all? Yeah. So and also yeah, and another thing that I wanted to say is that from what bioethicists usually say about this distinction, it follows. I feel it's a very like essentialist approach to these notions. So like there is such thing as therapy, and it's always stable, and it's always the same, and there is such thing as enhancement, whereas we can maybe develop a more like nuanced and more contextual approach to this. And if we are really attentive to the details of an empirical case, probably we come to a situation when we don't need this distinction at all, because it's always very dependent on the concrete material circumstances of our case. And that's pretty much goes to what Pavel Dmitrich said, that like when we take into account the context, yeah, when we apart from considering the human body and as a physiological or biological unit, when we go like into all the interconnectedness of different elements of this particular situation, we understand that maybe that this distinction is not relevant anymore. That's my ideas. Yep.
Thank you. I think I'm sympathetic to what you said, like with your final point about being sensitive to context and specificities of any intervention. I absolutely agree that that's what we should be doing. That's why also I propose these alternative criteria for cost-effective risk-benefit assessment and others. I think they're much more fine-grained, much more accurate. Whether or not that means we can do without the distinction, I don't know. I think it's when we seek to eliminate conditions that are regarded as pathologies, it does seem to me that we want to identify them as such, but I certainly agree that too much emphasis has often been placed on this distinction, and we can do better than that. Now, when you've mentioned that the sort of controversy surrounding the labeling of certain conditions as pathologies, and that's part of the bioethics debate. Although, to my knowledge, it's more often associated with deafness than blindness. So that's something I'd be interested in hearing from you. Do you hear a discourse among blind people similar to what some people in the deaf community are saying? Do some of them want to challenge the idea that blindness is a disability? Because I'm really not familiar with what their perception of their condition might be. Then your third point had to do with resources. So I mean, limited resources for the foreseeable future is the kind of situation we are working with. But I do believe, again, that it's easy to encounter questionable assumptions in this debate and on this reliance on the treatment enhancement distinction. So, for instance, one might think that enhancements would never be cost-effective, right? There could never be a cost-effective manner of addressing anything significant or any form of pathology, and that would be, I think, a prejudice, because we know, for instance, that certain forms of prevention are extremely cost-effective. When it comes to lung cancer, for instance, prevention campaigns to try and discourage people from smoking, these are very cost-effective. So there are, I think, to the extent that therapeutic enhancements could also be preventive interventions, and they would be biometric preventions, they could also be cost-effective, save potentially some of the very significant costs that are associated with aging associated disease. So this is again something that needs to be thought of. But as I said, I'd be interested in hearing what you think. Is there a parallel between like the deaf community and the blind community in terms of how they approach their condition and this idea of a disability versus just a different form of existence?
Okay, any other comments, opinions? You're welcome. So maybe it would be my turn, because I have planned to make some excurse in the grounds of analytic philosophy. From my point of view, they could be used some concepts, even not concepts, but some styles of thinking from the beginnings of 20th century. But from the one hand, they can make the problem of treatment and enhancement more clear, but from the other, they only make it more deep. If you remember, there was a philosopher, George Edward Moore, good friend of Bertrand Russell, and he proposed an argument of a real world at the beginning of 20th century. He only came to the seminar, analytical seminar, and told like this: this is an arm. This is another. And Ludwig Wittgenstein commented this thought experiment, this kind of thought experiment, when the realism, the world is only demonstrated. It was an Marx called On Certainty. So certainty, also this concept was used by Edmund Husserl, who said that our life world, Lebenswelt in German, is substructed by some basic certainties. One of these basic certainty is that we do not we don't doubt that we have two arms. If we was born with two arms, yeah, we have no doubt. It is something like basic facts about the world that are creating our phenomenological world. So then imagine that I have a third arm, for example. That is an arm, that is another, and here is another arm that maybe help me to drink coffee when I write the scientific article, and it also measures the level of the caffeine in my blood and helps me to drink. This fact basically changed my life world, because I have strict evidence, I have certainty that the level of caffeine in my blood is stable. And besides, I have the third arm. But is it an arm or is it not an arm? If it would be a robotic arm, it is not evident. So maybe the enhancement in very not modest but broad sense is something that changes our basic certainties about life world, change the substruction, the grounds of our life world. While the treatment, it also can change some structures, but it doesn't have some such big impact on other people. I mentioned Wittgenstein because he founded certainty, these basic facts of certainty, in the process of human interaction. When we interact with person who was blind and then become not blind, yes. Yes, this fact changes his life, his or her life world, but not our. We don't know what was in the past. But if we see a person with a sword arm, or if we see a person that is strictly enhanced, for example, can bear the sleep deprivation during a week without any consequences on his cognitive abilities, it would be the change of not even of a person's life world, but change of our life world, according to Husserl. So, do you and maybe other participants consider that we can not even use this concept because it is not ready for, it is not operationalized for the use in some distinctive manner, but we can start to think on this concept in the plan of treatment, enhancement, and some normative rules for biotechnologies.
So, in response to what you just explained, to me this suggests one interesting question about the respective transformative potential of treatments and enhancements on the human condition. And I agree that it does seem that enhancements are more transformative, at least potentially. One interesting question is, you were saying that treatments don't really change our life world, that they're sort of more conservative in nature. And I guess philosophically it's an interesting question. For instance, if you eliminate the main killers that we have today, which would be things like cancer, cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative diseases, well, it's been estimated that this would only give us a couple more years of life expectancy. The change would indeed not be radical in nature. One thing that tends to kill people who are very advanced in age is physical frailty, sort of age-associated frailty. And I guess one might ask, if we eliminated this type of condition, which kills the very elderly, those who have been lucky enough to escape cancer, cardiovascular disease, and dementia, would that be a treatment or would that be an enhancement to fortify these people, make them fit again? I'm not sure. If we think that doing this, it would be a treatment, that, you know, even purely therapeutic goals would require us to eliminate age-related frailty once we've gotten rid of all the diseases of old age, then it does sound like even therapy leads you to something like transhumanism. At least it leads to radical life extension. I'm not sure what the answer to the question.
Okay, thank you. And just a short comment. Your remark about tech killers just put me to the idea that basically we see in these modified tech killers that are killing, maybe genetically modified T killers that are able to kill cancer cells, we see something like intentional agents in these concrete cells. They are in our organism, but they have intention of that have a roots in our brain, not in our physiology, in our own intention to cure from cancer not to make some routine immune functions, not to bear these functions, but to kill the cancer cells. It is something like shared intentionality, by the way. Okay, are there other comments, questions?
Question, Serge, to your like attempt to define treatment and enhancement. So you said that if it doesn't affect our Lebenswelt, then it's not treatment, right? It's enhancement, something like this. So basically, when we talk about, you said an example of blind person, like if it only affects his or her Lebenswelt and it's not doesn't affect my Lebenswelt. But it's always difficult to distinguish I and they. I mean, so if that's, and we are like judging from the position of sighted people. So that's like, I think that might be a trouble. Yeah.
Thank you, Alexandra, for your question. Yes, I just didn't propose life word as a concept that give us some instrument for distinction. I just want to pay attention that there were time in philosophy, it was border between 19th and 20th century, when people put much attention to some basic facts, basic certainties. And now these certainties can be changed by biotechnologies, by enhancement. And we will have another scale, as Alexandra, you have mentioned an thought experiment when the anti-aging therapy would be so pure, so good that people around 80 they would have performance like people around 50 years now. So it changes some basic certainties of our social practices, of our communication, of our interaction. It is evident, but I think that often philosophy only articulates some evident things, and it is rather good just to make them explicit, not implicit. Thank you. And Alexander, do you have any comments, any questions for us?
Yes, I would have quite a few, but I'm not sure about any that would come spontaneously to mind. So maybe they're best left to after the workshop.
Okay. I just have one question for you. Was this workshop useful for you? Maybe you have listened some interesting or maybe potentially useful.
Absolutely, it has helped me clarify my ideas. The process of preparing this presentation has helped me think rigorously about various aspects of this debate. So I think I have clearer ideas now after speaking to you than just a few days before. So for this, I'm grateful to you, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to exchange about this topic. It's extremely interesting and enjoyable.
Thank you for your kind words, and we also want to thank you for very interesting and very deep and detailed view to the very actual problem of treatment and enhancement. I think we will keep in touch, and we are not finishing our discussion now because it is very useful for all of us, all of participants also. So thank you, Alexander. We are coming to the end of our workshop. It's a pity that you are not in Moscow because we have tea and pies for our participants. So it was nice to see you again, nice to hear your presentation, and besides to read your very detailed paper in Bioethics Journal. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.